Harlem, 1960. 8 combat veterans spent 6 months planning the perfect heist and pulled it off without a single mistake. They took $63,000 from the most protected operation in Harlem and disappeared into the night, convinced they had just brought Bumpy Johnson to his knees. What did Bumpy do next that made all 8 of them vanish without a trace? To understand how it all led here, we go back to where it truly began: Harlem, New York, the night of Thursday, September 8th, 1960. The city didn't sleep so much as it shifted the respectable crowds retreating indoors, while the other Harlem, the one that conducted its real business after midnight, came alive in doorways and back rooms and on corners where the streetlights had been conveniently broken for years. It was the kind of night that felt ordinary right up until the moment it wasn't. Warm air sitting heavy over the neighborhood, jazz bleeding through the walls of 3 different clubs on the same block, the smell of rain that never came mixing with cigarette smoke, and the particular urban exhaustion of a city that had been grinding itself down for decades without ever quite breaking. Nobody on West 133rd Street was paying attention to the building at the end of the block. That was the point. Bumpy Johnson's operation didn't announce itself with signs or obvious activity. The office, a second-floor space above a dry goods store that had been closed since 1957, looked like nothing. Looked abandoned. Looked like exactly the kind of place that a man building a criminal empire back from near collapse would never choose as a financial nerve center. Which was precisely why Johnson had chosen it 18 months ago, when he'd walked out of federal prison and begun the quiet, methodical work of rebuilding what the government had spent 4 years trying to destroy. Inside that unremarkable building, on any given Thursday night, there was enough cash moving through to fund a small municipal government, policy bank receipts from 14 collection points across Upper Manhattan, numbers from the Bronx operations that fed back into Harlem's central accounting, the week's proceeds from a dozen enterprises that didn't appear in any ledger the federal government had ever been permitted to examine. It was the financial heart of the most sophisticated criminal organization in Harlem's history, protected by men Johnson trusted absolutely, tucked inside a building that the outside world had forgotten existed. At 17 minutes past 3 in the morning, a sanitation worker named Curtis Webb was making his way down the alley beside the building when he stopped walking. He stopped because his flashlight had caught something that his brain needed several full seconds to process. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that made him take 3 slow steps backward before he found his voice and began shouting for anyone within earshot to come and see what he was looking at. Marcus Green, 26 years old and one of Bumpy Johnson's most trusted night sentries, was seated in a wooden chair that had been dragged from inside the building and placed directly in front of the main entrance. His hands were bound behind him with telephone wire. His ankles were secured to the chair legs with the same wire, twisted tight enough to leave marks that would still be visible a week later. His mouth was stuffed, not taped, not gagged with cloth, but physically packed with folded currency. 10s and 20s, crisp and deliberate, pressed into his mouth with enough force that his jaw had been forced open to an unnatural angle. Around his neck, hung on a piece of string like a child's handmade necklace, was an index card. 4 words written in block letters with a red marker. 4 words that were not a boast or a threat, but a simple statement of accomplished fact. We were already inside. The safe was empty, not broken into dramatically, not blown open with the kind of theatrical violence that left debris and blast marks. Opened. The door hung on its hinges at an almost gentle angle. The lock mechanism disengaged with a precision that suggested someone who understood the specific model, who had studied it, who had perhaps practiced on an identical unit before arriving on West 133rd Street. The cash was gone. Every dollar. The betting slips. The ledgers. The operational records for the week gone. Approximately $63,000 in a single night, extracted from the most secure location in Bumpy Johnson's rebuilt empire, from a building that barely a dozen people in New York knew existed. Marcus Green was alive. Whoever had done this had gone to considerable trouble to make sure of that, which was in some ways the most unsettling detail of all. They could have hurt him. They had chosen not to. The message didn't require his suffering. The message required his survival, his ability to look into the eyes of the men who came to untie him and describe what had happened, to tell them how many there were, how they moved, how long it took. The message required a witness, someone who would carry the story back to Bumpy Johnson with his own voice and his own trembling hands as evidence. The message was clear enough that it didn't need translation. We know where you are. We got inside without you knowing. We took what we wanted, and we left your man alive because we wanted you to understand exactly what just happened. What the message didn't say, what its author hadn't anticipated needing to say, was who had sent it. Because Bobby Malone had spent 6 months constructing a plan so thorough, so layered with contingencies and studied intelligence, that he was absolutely certain the answer to that question would be obvious. He wanted Johnson to know. He wanted Johnson to understand, from the very first moment, exactly who had done this and exactly why Johnson would be unable to stop what came next. Bobby Raymond Malone had arrived in Harlem in the spring of 1960 with $42,000, 8 men who had served under him in Korea, and a theory. The theory was simple, elegant, and as theories constructed by intelligent people who have never been truly tested tend to be catastrophically incomplete. The theory was this: Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was a legend built on a foundation that no longer existed. The Johnson of 1935, the man who had driven Dutch Schultz out of Harlem through discipline and strategic brilliance, was real. That Johnson had been formidable, but that Johnson had then spent the better part of 2 decades being arrested, tried, imprisoned, released, and arrested again. That Johnson had watched his organization dismantled by federal prosecutors. That Johnson had walked out of Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in 1958 as a 50-year-old man with a heart condition, a complicated relationship with the law, and an empire that needed to be rebuilt from near zero. The legend remained. The machine behind the legend had been broken. Malone had researched this with the thoroughness that had made him an exceptional intelligence officer in the Army. He had spent 3 months before arriving in Harlem simply studying Johnson from a distance, reading everything available, talking to people in other cities who had done business with Johnson's organization, building a picture of the operation's current state. Then he had spent another 3 months in Harlem itself, watching, listening, mapping the collection routes, identifying the key personnel, locating the financial infrastructure. He had found the office on West 133rd Street through a combination of patient surveillance and a source inside the city's property records who had traced utility payments back to a shell company that Malone had correctly identified as Johnson's. He had not found the office because Johnson was careless. He had found it because he was exceptionally good at finding things. This distinction mattered enormously, though Malone had not yet understood why. At 28, Bobby Malone was the most capable adversary Bumpy Johnson had faced in years. His men were disciplined, loyal, and experienced in ways that most criminal operators could only approximate. He had planned the robbery with military precision: the entry team, the extraction team, the lookouts, the timing, the contingency protocols. He had accounted for the night guard rotation, the response time of Johnson's closest associates, the layout of the building's interior. He had spent 6 hours inside an identical model of the safe in a warehouse in the Bronx, learning its mechanisms until he could open it in under 4 minutes in complete darkness. The operation had gone exactly as planned. $63,000 recovered without incident. his men out of the building before the nearest backup could respond. Marcus Green left alive and tied to that chair with that index card around his neck, because Malone understood correctly that the most powerful message wasn't violence. It was demonstration. The demonstration of capability. The demonstration of knowledge. The demonstration that he had been inside the heart of Bumpy Johnson's operation and walked out with everything he wanted. What Malone had not accounted for, what the 6 months of meticulous research had failed to reveal, was that preparation and intelligence, however thorough, are only as good as the assumptions they rest on. Malone had assumed that the Johnson he was studying was the whole picture. He had assumed that what he could observe was what existed. He had assumed, at the deepest level, that Bumpy Johnson was playing the same game Malone was playing, by the same rules, on the same board. By mid-morning the following day, Harlem knew. Not the details. The details circulated in whispers through the specific channels that criminal information always traveled, but the broad shape of it. Someone had hit Bumpy Johnson's operation. Someone had gotten inside, taken the money, left a man tied to a chair. The neighborhood processed this information the way it processed all significant events, with a mixture of genuine shock and carefully calibrated public reaction. Because in Harlem, how you responded to news like this said as much about you as anything else. Inside the network of Johnson's organization, the response was not calibrated at all. It was immediate, volcanic, and unanimous. Men who had been with Johnson for a decade arrived at the secondary location on 141st Street within the hour, their faces carrying the particular expression of people who have been insulted in a way that demands a physical answer. Weapons were discussed. Names were floated. The general consensus, expressed with varying degrees of restraint depending on the speaker, was that whoever had done this needed to be found and found immediately, and that what happened after the finding was not a matter requiring extended deliberation. Calvin Briggs, Johnson's most senior lieutenant and the man who had been running operations during the difficult years, stood at the center of the room and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Where is he?" Bumpy Johnson was in the kitchen. Not the kitchen of the 140th Street location, which had no kitchen. The kitchen of the small apartment 2 floors above it, where Johnson maintained a private space that most of his organization had never entered. He was standing at the stove when Calvin came upstairs, a small copper pot heating on the front burner, the particular careful attention of a man who takes his coffee seriously evident in the way he was watching the temperature. On the kitchen table, open to a page somewhere in the middle, was a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, the same copy, worn at the spine and marked throughout in pencil, that Johnson had been reading in sections for the better part of 15 years. Calvin stood in the doorway and delivered the full account. The amount taken, the condition of the safe, the details of how Marcus Green had been found, the index card, every piece of information his people had assembled in the past several hours about how the entry had been accomplished and by whom. Johnson listened without speaking. He poured his coffee when it was ready. He carried it to the table and sat down across from the open book without closing it. He looked at the page for a moment, not reading, just looking, and then he looked up at Calvin. "Is it raining today?" he asked. Calvin stared at him. "What? Is it raining? I thought I heard thunder earlier, but I wasn't sure." "Bumpy." Calvin's voice carried the strained quality of a man exercising significant patience. $63,000. "I heard you." Marcus had wire marks on his wrists down to the bone. "I heard you, Calvin. The men are ready to move. We have 3 names already that tell them to go home." Johnson picked up his coffee. "Tell them we're handling it." The silence that followed was the kind that filled a room completely. Calvin Briggs had been with Bumpy Johnson through federal prosecutions, through territorial wars, through years of prison and rebuilding and loss that would have destroyed a lesser man entirely. He had seen Johnson angry in ways that were genuinely frightening. He had seen Johnson cold in ways that were somehow worse. What he was seeing now was neither of those things. And that, more than anything else that had happened since 3 in the morning, made the hair on his arms stand up. "Handling it how?" Calvin asked. Johnson didn't answer. He opened a desk drawer, removed a notepad and a pen, and wrote something down in the careful, precise handwriting that people who knew him always found slightly incongruous with everything else about him. He tore the sheet from the pad, folded it once, and held it out. "Send someone to that address," he said. "Tell them Bumpy Johnson needs the package he requested last Tuesday." Calvin took the paper. He looked at it. He looked at Johnson. "You requested something last Tuesday." "Before last night," Johnson said, and returned to his coffee. It was shortly before 2 in the afternoon when the envelope arrived at the 140 Street location, delivered by a young man nobody recognized who left immediately after handing it to the man at the door. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The note had no salutation, no context, no explanation of what it represented or how it had been obtained. Just a name: Bobby Raymond Malone, formerly Staff Sergeant, 7th Infantry Division, an address in Washington Heights, and a list of 8 names beneath it with brief descriptions. 8 men, their physical descriptions, their approximate locations, their roles in an organization that, according to the sheet of paper, had been operating in Harlem for the better part of 6 months. Calvin read it twice. Then he walked upstairs and stood in the kitchen doorway again and looked at Bumpy Johnson, who was still sitting at the table with Marcus Aurelius, and said nothing for a long moment because there didn't seem to be anything adequate to say. "How long have you known?" he finally asked. Johnson didn't look up from the page. "Long enough," he said. The envelope arrived at the 140th Street location at 11 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, delivered this time by a child of perhaps 12 who accepted a quarter for his trouble and disappeared down the block at a run. The envelope was standard, white, unsealed. Inside was a photograph, a single photograph, 4 inches by 6, black and white, slightly underexposed in the upper right corner, the way photographs taken in low light without a flash tended to be in 1960. The photograph showed Bumpy Johnson sitting at his kitchen table, the same table where he had been sitting that morning with his coffee and his Marcus Aurelius, shot from outside, through the window, from an angle that required the photographer to have been positioned on the fire escape of the building directly adjacent a building that Johnson's people swept regularly. That sat inside what should have been an impenetrable security perimeter. The timestamp on the edge of the photograph, the kind that certain camera models printed automatically, read 3 nights prior, 72 hours before the robbery, before the index card and the empty safe and Marcus Green tied to a chair with telephone wire. Malone had been on that fire escape before any of this began. Malone had photographed Johnson in his private kitchen, the room that most of his organization had never entered, and had done so without being detected, without triggering any of the awareness that Johnson's people maintained around their principal at all times. And the note clipped to the back of the photograph was 4 lines, written in the same block letters as the index card. "I was this close 3 nights ago. I could have ended it then. I didn't, because that's not what this is about. This is about you understanding that everything you think protects you doesn't." The room went absolutely still, not the quiet of people being careful, but the deeper stillness of people confronting something that had rearranged their understanding of the situation entirely. Because there is a robbery, and there is a territorial challenge, and there is the kind of criminal ambition that the underworld produces in steady supply, and then there is this, a photograph taken in a private kitchen 72 hours before a robbery. delivered in an envelope to prove that the man holding it had been observed in his most protected space before the first act of hostility had even occurred. This was something different. This was a declaration of comprehensive surveillance. This was someone saying, "I have been watching you longer and more closely than you knew. And I want you to sit with that knowledge before we continue." Calvin Briggs, who had not sat down since arriving that morning, sat down. 3 of the men in the room left without being dismissed, simply walked out because the air had become difficult to breathe. And Bumpy Johnson, who had been standing near the window when the envelope was opened, who had looked at the photograph for a long time without expression, who had read the note with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything, did something that nobody in that room had expected. He smiled, not the broad smile of a man who has received good news, not the tight smile of a man performing confidence he doesn't feel. A quiet smile, slight and inward, the kind that appears on a person's face when something has confirmed exactly what they suspected, when the world has arranged itself in precisely the configuration they anticipated, and the only emotion available is a thin, cold satisfaction. Calvin watched that smile appear and felt something move through him that he couldn't quite name. He had known Bumpy Johnson for 19 years. He had seen him in federal court and in hospital rooms and in the lowest moments that a human life can produce. He had never been frightened of him. Not once. In 19 years. He was frightened now. Johnson folded the photograph carefully, placed it in his shirt pocket, and walked to the telephone on the wall. He picked up the receiver. He dialed a number from memory, 7 digits without hesitation, and waited while it rang. It rang 4 times before someone picked up. The voice on the other end said nothing, just the sound of breathing and the ambient noise of wherever Bobby Malone was at that moment. Wherever he was sitting with his $42,000 and his 8 Korean War veterans and his theory about a weakened lion. Johnson let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the same quiet, unhurried quality it always carried. The tone of a man who has never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be heard. "You forgot to check one thing," Johnson said. He replaced the receiver before Malone could respond. He turned back toward the room, toward the men staring at him, toward Calvin Briggs, sitting in a chair with an expression that had moved well past confusion into something approaching genuine fear. Nobody asked what the one thing was, and in the silence that followed, in the absence of that question, was the first indication that everyone in the room already understood at some level beneath language, in the part of the mind that processes danger before the conscious brain catches up, that what was coming next had already been decided, that the chessboard had been set up before any of them had walked into the room, that somewhere between the moment Bobby Malone had climbed onto that fire escape 3 nights ago, photograph in hand, absolutely certain of his own brilliance, and the moment Bumpy Johnson had smiled at a photograph that was supposed to terrify him, something had shifted so fundamentally that the game Malone thought he was playing no longer existed. The only question that remained, and it was a question that would keep Bobby Malone awake for the next 48 hours, turning it over and over in his mind with the desperate focus of a man who has just realized he is standing in a room he doesn't recognize, was what? Exactly. He had forgotten to check. Bobby Malone did not sleep on Friday night. He did not sleep on Saturday night either. He sat in the back room of the Washington Heights apartment, the one he had chosen precisely because it appeared on no document connected to his name, paid for in cash through a third party, swept for surveillance equipment twice weekly, and he went through the plan again. Not quickly, not impatiently, but with the same methodical discipline he had applied to every intelligence problem the Army had ever given him. He laid it out from the beginning. Every decision point, every piece of information he had gathered and how he had gathered it, every person he had used and how he had used them, Every assumption he had made and the evidence that had supported it. He found nothing. That was the problem. Not the finding of something, a leak, an error, a moment of carelessness that could be identified and explained and therefore contained. The problem was the absence of anything to find. The plan was sound. The execution had been clean. The operation on West 133rd Street had gone precisely as designed, which meant that whatever Bumpy Johnson knew and the phone call had made it unmistakably clear that Johnson knew something. It hadn't come from a mistake Malone had made. It had come from somewhere else entirely, from some layer of the situation that Malone's 6 months of preparation had not reached. "You forgot to check one thing." He turned the sentence over for the 40th time, examining it from different angles, the way you examine a lock you can't open, looking for the mechanism, the point of entry, the logic that would make the tumblers fall into alignment. 7 words, delivered without anger, without triumph, without any of the emotional coloring that people used when they wanted to intimidate. Just information, stated with the calm certainty of a man reporting the weather. Which made it worse, somehow, than any threat could have been. A threat told you what someone intended to do. This told you what someone already knew. By Sunday morning, the confidence that had carried Malone through 6 months of preparation and a perfectly executed robbery had undergone a transformation so complete that he barely recognized it. Confidence had become vigilance. Vigilance had become suspicion. Suspicion had settled into something deeper and more corrosive, the particular anxiety of a man who understands that the ground he is standing on may not be as solid as it appeared, but cannot identify where the weakness is, cannot find the fault line, can only feel it somewhere beneath his feet, shifting imperceptibly. He began watching his own men. Not obviously, Malone was too disciplined for obvious, but with the careful peripheral attention of someone cataloging small deviations from established pattern. The timing of arrivals and departures, who spoke to whom and for how long, who asked questions they had no operational reason to ask. It was the kind of surveillance he had been trained to conduct on enemy personnel, and the fact that he was now applying it to the 8 men who had crossed the Pacific with him, who had trusted him with their lives in circumstances that made a Harlem robbery look trivial, said more about what those 7 words had done to him than anything else could. The deviation, when it appeared, was small enough that a less disciplined observer would have missed it entirely. Dennis Tate, 29 years old, former corporal, the man Malone had assigned to run the lookout rotation during the West 133rd Street operation, left the apartment on Sunday afternoon and walked 6 blocks east before taking the subway, which was unusual because Tate always took the bus. A preference, seemingly meaningless, the kind of individual habit that people maintain without awareness, except that Tate had mentioned the bus preference 4 times in 6 months of conversation, had mentioned it as recently as Thursday, and was now descending into a subway station with the slightly accelerated pace of someone who had somewhere specific to be. Malone followed him from a distance that would have been invisible to anyone not trained in counter-surveillance. Tate rode the subway to 125th Street. He walked 3 blocks. He entered a barber shop that Malone did not recognize and stayed inside for 22 minutes. When he emerged, he took a different route back, which was either the behavior of someone who understood they might be followed or simply a man who varied his routine. Both possibilities were bad. Malone was waiting in the apartment when Tate returned. He was sitting in the chair by the window, which put his face in shadow, and Tate's in the afternoon light. And when Tate saw him sitting there, the half-second delay before Tate's expression arranged itself into something neutral was all Malone needed to know that the answer to the question he was about to ask was not going to be what he wanted to hear. "The barber shop," Malone said. Tate said nothing for a moment. Then he sat down across from Malone. Not because he was invited to, but because his legs appeared to make the decision independently. He looked at his hands. He looked at the floor. He looked everywhere except the shadow where Malone's face was. "How long?" Malone asked. The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. "Dennis." Malone's voice was very quiet. "How long?" "4 months," Tate said. 4 months. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a significant height. 4 months before the robbery. 4 months before Malone had finalized the plan. Before he had selected the target location. Before he had made the critical decisions that defined the shape of the entire operation. 4 months ago, Malone had still been in the intelligence gathering phase, still building his picture of Johnson's organization, still working out the theory that the aging, recently imprisoned Johnson represented a vulnerable moment in Harlem's criminal history. 4 months ago, someone from Bumpy Johnson's organization had found Dennis Tate and had a conversation, and whatever had been said in that conversation, whatever had been offered or demonstrated or quietly made clear, had been sufficient to turn a man who had taken enemy fire in Korea without flinching into a source of information flowing steadily in the wrong direction. "What did you tell them?" Malone asked. Tate told him. All of it. The location of the Washington Heights apartment, the names and descriptions of every man in the crew, the timeline of the operation, as it had developed and been refined over the months. The target West 133rd Street confirmed 3 weeks before the robbery. The approach, the entry method, the planned extraction route, the contingencies, everything Tate had known, which was nearly everything there was to know. Delivered in pieces over 4 months to a contact he met at a barber shop on 125th Street, who never told him his name. Malone listened without interrupting. He asked clarifying questions at 3 points, not because the picture was unclear, but because he needed to understand the precise dimensions of what he was looking at. When Tate finished, Malone was quiet for a long time. Outside, the Sunday afternoon sounds of Washington Heights continued their indifferent performance children. Traffic. Someone's radio through an open window playing something with a trumpet line that kept ascending and never quite resolving. The thing that Malone kept returning to, in the silence, was not the betrayal. Betrayal, in the world he operated in, was a known quantity, a risk that any competent operator accounted for. What he kept returning to was the timing. Johnson had known about the plan before the plan was final, had known about the target, the crew, the approach, had known 4 months in advance that Bobby Malone was coming, and had done nothing to prevent it, had not moved the money, had not reinforced the security, had not made any adjustment to the operation on West 133rd Street that would have indicated awareness of the incoming threat. Johnson had let the robbery happen. He had known it was coming, and he had let it happen. And he had left Marcus Green tied to that chair and let Malone send the photograph and the note about being this close. And he had received all of it with a calm that Malone had read as composure but was now understanding was something else entirely. Not composure. Not the steadiness of a man controlling his reaction to a genuine shock. The stillness of a man watching a sequence of events unfold exactly as he had anticipated. The patience of a chess player who has seen the endgame from the opening move and is simply waiting for his opponent to arrive at the position that was always inevitable. The $63,000 that Malone had taken from that safe Malone understood now, with a clarity that was almost physical in its impact, that the money had been placed there deliberately, that the safe had been stocked for this specific occasion, that the number, 63,000, had been calculated as sufficient to make the robbery feel significant and complete without being large enough to represent a real loss to an organization of Johnson's scale. He had been handed a victory. The victory had been the first room of the trap. Malone made his decision at 11 minutes past 10 on Sunday night. He made it not from a position of strength or strategic clarity, but from the particular desperation of a man who has watched his carefully constructed position dissolve around him, and understands that waiting for further dissolution is not a viable alternative. Attack. Direct. Immediate. Maximum force. Hit the center of Johnson's operation before Johnson could complete whatever sequence he had been building toward. Move first. Move hard. Move now. And trust that the military capability he and his men represented would be sufficient to overcome the intelligence disadvantage he was now undeniably operating under. He pulled his 7 remaining men together. He had the address of the primary location on 141st Street. Tate had given that too. Months ago. And now Malone understood why he'd been given it so easily. Though he pushed that understanding aside because examining it too carefully led to places he couldn't afford to go. He had the layout from the surveillance he'd conducted himself. He had 7 men who were frightened now, whose confidence had been shaken by the Sunday afternoon revelation in the Washington Heights apartment, but who were still disciplined enough to follow orders and execute a plan. The plan was simple, because simple was all the situation allowed. Enter the 141st Street building at midnight. Move fast. Find Johnson. Find the money. Finish it. Simplicity had the advantage of leaving less room for the kind of elaborate counter-preparation that Johnson apparently excelled at. No complex choreography to be anticipated and subverted. Just 8 men moving through a door with a clear objective. They moved through Harlem at 11:43, traveling in 2 vehicles, approaching the 141st Street block from separate directions. The way Malone had been taught to approach any objective where the enemy's exact disposition was unknown. The night was overcast. No moon. The streetlights casting their usual insufficient pools of orange on the pavement below. The neighborhood was quiet in the particular way it became quiet late on a Sunday, the social activity of the weekend winding down. Only the committed night people still moving. The 140th Street building showed 2 lights on the 2nd floor. Ground floor. Dark. No visible activity in the street nearby. No unusual vehicle presence. Nothing that distinguished it from any of the 100 other Harlem buildings sitting under that overcast sky at 11:43 on a Sunday night. Malone took this in and felt, despite everything, the slight steadying effect of a tactical situation that appeared to match his intelligence. The feeling lasted approximately 90 seconds. They went through the door at 11:53. Ground floor, high floor clear. Exactly as expected. Stairwell clear. They moved up the stairs with the disciplined quiet of men who had cleared buildings in circumstances considerably more dangerous than this. Weapons ready. Each man covering his assigned sector. The team moving as the unit it had trained to be in conditions that made a Harlem staircase seem almost comfortable by comparison. The 2nd floor door opened into darkness. Total darkness. Which was not what the lights from outside had suggested. Which meant the lights had been on a timer or operated from somewhere else or placed in the windows specifically to indicate occupation that didn't exist. Malone processed this information in the fraction of a second available before his eyes adjusted, and he saw, in the center of the otherwise empty room, a single table, a single lamp casting a circle of yellow light, and a man sitting in that light reading a book. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson looked up from the page with the mild expression of someone who has been interrupted at a natural pause in the text, rather than by 8 armed men emerging from a darkened stairwell. He was wearing a gray suit. No tie. His jacket buttoned despite the warmth of the room. The book Malone would later remember this detail with the clarity that extreme moments tend to preserve was the same worn copy of Marcus Aurelius that he had been reading that morning. He turned a page, unhurried, and set it face down on the table with the careful attention of a man who intends to return to it shortly. Then the sounds began. Not loud sounds, not the dramatic sounds of a confrontation announcing itself. Small sounds, coming from the darkness surrounding the circle of lamplight, the slight shift of weight on floorboards, the almost imperceptible adjustment of position that a person makes when they have been standing still for a long time and permit themselves a single small movement. The sounds of presence, of bodies occupying space, of people standing in the dark in numbers that the sounds made impossible to estimate, but impossible to underestimate. How many there were, Malone never fully determined. The darkness was too complete and the sounds were too distributed behind him, beside him, above him from what must have been a mezzanine or a partial upper floor he hadn't known existed. What he understood, standing in that circle of lamplight's outer edge with 7 men behind him and sounds coming from every direction in the dark, was that the room contained far more people than his crew, that they had been there when he arrived, that they had been there, probably, for hours. Johnson looked at him with an expression that contained no triumph, no satisfaction, no theatrical display of the advantage he so completely held. Just the attentive calm of a man in a situation he had prepared for so thoroughly that it required no emotional expenditure whatsoever. "You're 7 minutes late," Johnson said. His voice was conversational, the tone of someone noting a minor scheduling inconvenience. "I had you at midnight, exactly." Malone said nothing. There was nothing to say that would improve his position, and he understood that well enough to stay quiet, which was perhaps the only tactically sound decision available to him in that moment. "Sit down," Johnson said, and gestured toward the chair on the opposite side of the table with the same unhurried courtesy he might have extended to a business associate arriving for a scheduled meeting. Malone sat. Behind him, he heard the sound of his men being relieved of their weapons in the darkness, not struggling, not resisting, because whatever they could hear and sense around them communicated with perfect efficiency that resistance was not an option worth calculating. 7 men, disarmed in the dark, and the only sound was the slight mechanical activity of weapons being secured and the continued small sounds of people moving in the periphery. Johnson looked at him across the table for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced an envelope, which he placed on the table between them and slid across with 2 fingers. Malone looked at it. He looked at Johnson. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in Johnson's precise handwriting, was a list. The list began with Dennis Tate's name and the date of his first contact with Johnson's organization 4 months and 11 days ago. Below Tate's name were 7 more entries, 7 more names, 7 more dates, ranging from 2 months ago to 6 weeks ago. 7 more members of Malone's crew, each with a date of first contact and a brief notation of what they had provided. All 8 of them, every man Malone had brought from Korea. Every man he had trusted with the Washington Heights location and the operational details and the timeline and the plan. All 8 of them had been contacted. All 8 had cooperated, and the dates made clear that the contacts had been sequential and deliberate, beginning with Tate and working outward through the crew's social connections with the patience and precision of someone who was not reacting to a threat, but building a complete picture of it from the outside in. Malone read the list twice. He looked up at Johnson. "You built this before I finished building mine," he said. It wasn't a question. "I started building it," Johnson said, "the week you arrived in Harlem." The week he arrived, 6 months ago, before the surveillance phase was complete, before the target was selected, before any overt action had been taken that would have signaled hostile intent. Johnson had identified him as a threat in the first week and had spent the subsequent 6 months not preparing to stop him, but preparing to use him, letting the plan develop, letting the robbery proceed, letting Malone believe he was executing a brilliant operation against a weakened opponent. While underneath all of it, Johnson's people had been inside the crew from the beginning, watching the plan take shape, feeding information back, waiting for the precise moment when the trap had fully assembled itself. The $63,000. the photograph on the fire escape, the index card around Marcus Green's neck, the phone call. All of it, every element that Malone had constructed as a demonstration of his own capability, had been permitted, had been, in the most precise sense, arranged. Malone sat with this for a long moment. Outside, somewhere in the Harlem night, a car moved down the block and its headlights swept briefly through the window and then were gone. The lamp on the table continued its work, casting its circle of light in which two men sat across from each other, one of whom had spent 6 months preparing a trap, and one of whom had spent 6 months walking into it. "The one thing," Malone said quietly. "The thing I forgot to check." Johnson nodded once, the minimal acknowledgement of a teacher whose student has finally arrived at the correct answer. "You checked everything about my operation." Johnson said, "You never checked whether my operation was also checking you." The silence that followed was complete. And in that silence, Bobby Malone understood, with the full weight of everything the evening had demonstrated, that this room, this table, this lamp, this precise and terrible accounting was not the end of anything. It was a threshold. The first room, and whatever came next had been decided with the same unhurried certainty that had governed everything else. Decided long before Malone had climbed that fire escape with his camera. Long before he had stood over an empty safe, feeling like a man who had just won something. The question was not what Bumpy Johnson was going to do. The question, sitting in that chair with darkness breathing around him on all sides, was how many more rooms there were. There was no battle. There was never going to be one. By the time the first gray light of Monday morning began working its way through the gaps between Harlem's buildings, Bobby Malone's crew had ceased to exist as an organized unit. Not destroyed, dissolved. The distinction mattered. Because destruction leaves evidence. Dissolution leaves nothing. One by one, through the small hours before dawn, 8 men made individual decisions to be somewhere other than New York. Some left with what they could carry in a single bag. Some left with less than that. None of them coordinated their departures. None of them said goodbye to the others. None of them left forwarding addresses or explanations or any trace of the 6 months they had spent building something in Washington Heights that had turned out to be, from its very foundation, someone else's construction. The Washington Heights apartment was empty by 5 in the morning. The back room where Malone had spent 2 sleepless nights examining his perfect plan contained nothing but a wooden chair and the particular quality of silence that a space acquires when the people who occupied it have understood, with complete finality, that they are not coming back. No confrontation had been necessary, no demonstration of force beyond what the darkness of that second-floor room had already communicated so efficiently. Johnson's people had simply made clear, in the quiet aftermath of the table and the lamp and the list of 8 names, what the available futures looked like, and the men who had crossed the Pacific together and trusted each other in circumstances that should have made them unbreakable, had each, independently, chosen the future that didn't end in a Harlem building. This was the most precise measure of what Bumpy Johnson had built over 30 years in that neighborhood. Not the money, not the network, not even the intelligence apparatus that had disassembled Malone's operation from the inside out. It was this, the ability to end a threat so completely, so quietly, that the threat simply chose to stop existing rather than continue. The most dangerous thing in any room is the thing you cannot see and cannot measure. Johnson had spent a career making himself exactly that. The $63,000 reappeared on Tuesday morning. Not delivered dramatically. Not returned with a message or a demonstration. It arrived in a plain bag left outside the 141st Street location, sometime before the neighborhood woke up. The bills bundled neatly, the full amount intact. Calvin Briggs counted it twice. He brought the number to Johnson, who nodded once and returned to his newspaper. And that was the entirety of the ceremony surrounding the recovery of money that had briefly and deliberately been allowed to leave. Word moved through Harlem's underworld with the speed that significant information always traveled in that community through barbershops and card games, and the quiet conversations that happened in the back of establishments where the front was doing something else entirely. The story that moved, however, was incomplete in ways that were themselves the message. Nobody knew exactly what had happened in that second-floor room. Nobody could say with certainty what had been said between Johnson and the man who had come to remove him, or what the resolution of that conversation had looked like, or where Bobby Malone had gone afterward and whether he had gone under his own power. The story had a beginning. The robbery, the photograph, the phone call, and it had an ending: the empty apartment, the returned money. 8 men gone from Harlem overnight. The middle was a blank, and the blank was intentional. And every criminal operator in New York who heard the story understood what the blank meant. It meant that whatever had happened was not something Johnson needed anyone to know about. It meant the outcome had been so complete that the specifics were irrelevant. It meant that somewhere between Sunday night and Monday morning, a man who had spent 6 months preparing to take something from Bumpy Johnson had instead lost everything he'd brought with him, and the most frightening part was not knowing how, or even quite where. The losing had begun. Bobby Malone was never seen in Harlem again, whether he left New York entirely, or simply understood that the geography of his future had been permanently and irrevocably redrawn. Nobody who told the story afterward could say with certainty. He had arrived with a theory and $42,000 and 8 loyal men and 6 months of meticulous preparation. He left without any of those things, and without the story of his departure, and that absence of drama, of evidence, of even a clear narrative of defeat became its own kind of legend in the years that followed. The morning after, Bumpy Johnson sat in his kitchen at the small table where Marcus Aurelius still lay face down from 2 days prior. The coffee was the same copper pot, the same careful attention to temperature, the same unhurried ritual of a man for whom mornings represented a form of deliberate reset. He read the newspaper with the systematic patience he brought to all information front page, then national, then local, then eventually, sports. The city had continued its indifferent business throughout the weekend's events. The newspaper confirmed this. The world had not paused to acknowledge what had happened on 141st Street. Calvin Briggs came in at 7:30, poured himself coffee without asking, and sat down across from Johnson. He watched Johnson read the sports page for a moment. Then he asked the question that had been sitting with him since Sunday night. Since the list of 8 names. Since the week you arrived in Harlem. Did you know from the very beginning? Calvin asked. Johnson didn't answer immediately. He finished the paragraph he was reading, turned the page, considered the box scores with the same attention he gave everything. Then he set the paper down and picked up his coffee. The most dangerous man in any room, Johnson said quietly, is not the strongest one. It's the one who makes his opponent defeat himself. He took a sip, set the cup down, picked up the newspaper again. Calvin sat with that for a long moment. Outside, Harlem was waking up, the sounds of a Monday morning assembling themselves into the ordinary texture of the neighborhood. Somewhere on the block, a delivery truck, children beginning to appear on sidewalks. The city, resuming. Real power makes no sound. It leaves no blood, no wreckage, no dramatic evidence of its passage through events. It moves like weather that has already happened. You see only the aftermath. The stillness. The morning that looks exactly like every other morning, except that something that existed yesterday is simply gone. Bobby Malone had come to Harlem with a theory about a weakened lion. He had spent 6 months studying the lion's habits, mapping the lion's territory, recruiting the lion's own companions to his cause. He had been so thorough, so intelligent, so certain of his own careful preparation, that he had never stopped to consider the possibility that the lion had been watching him from the first day. Not because the lion needed to, but because that was simply how the lion had survived 30 years in a neighborhood that had consumed everyone who underestimated it. By 9 in the morning on Monday, September 12th, 1960, it was as though Bobby Malone and his 8 men had never existed at all, and that the completeness of the erasure, the silence where a battle should have been, the ordinary morning sitting undisturbed over the whole of it, was the most eloquent statement Bumpy Johnson ever made about the nature of power. Not what you do to your enemies, what you make them do to themselves.